Thank you, Dylan, for sharing that exclusive with us. And also thank you, Tom, Owen, Axel, Lord Brown. We've had some brilliant insights already today on how we can, as an industry and as a society, ensure that we build back better. However, before we head into the final panel of the day, I wanted to let you know that today's symposium is the kickoff for 2 virtual conferences that we will be hosting later this year, dedicated to the energy transition. So there's Energy Transition North America, which is going to be hosted on November the 19th and 20th. That is focused on the US market and the transition there, with a particular focus on leadership, cities, mobility, economy and legacy, and solutions. Then the week after that, we are hosting the first ever Energy Transition Europe. That is on November the 23rd and 24th. And again, whilst that's focused predominantly on the EU markets, that's going to have a particular flavour around the governance, financing, infrastructure and business model innovation related to the energy transition. If you're watching live, I think even on demand, you'll see the banners at the side of each page right now. You'll see both the North American and the EU one. Simply, if you want to find out more, click through to those banners to see the amazing speaker lineups that we have across both the days of each of those events. They really are shaping up to be something very special. The final panel of the day will explore if clean energy will prove to be the agent for recovery and what you can ensure to do that it actually does. But remember, this is a live panel and you can put your questions at any point to our panelists and to our moderator. Slido is just below on the screen, or you can log on to Slido, the Slido website, which is SLIDO, and just put in there Energy 2020. That's the password that'll get you logged in. So, going to our final panel for the day. Joining us to chair the discussion is Russell Boyer. This is Dell's Energy Field Director for Utility IoT. Russell, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you to all the great speakers that we've heard so far. My name is Russell Boyer. I'm the Global Energy Field Director at Dell Technology, focused on utilities and edge and IoT. In this final session, we're going to explore how clean energy can provide the stimulus and power for economic recovery, and how technology plays a part. Joining us today, we have 4 world-class speakers from across the globe. In the energy field, we have Camilla Palladino, Executive Vice President of Strategy and Investor Relationships at SNAM, which in 2019 was one of the first companies in Europe to introduce a mix of 5% hydrogen and natural gas in its transmission network. We have Axel Thiemann, CEO of Sonidex, a leading solar power producer with more than 260 solar plants across 8 countries and over 1 gigawatts of operational capacity. We have Lauren Turin, General Manager of the Global CCS Institute, one of the world's leading carbon capture storage think tanks, and as I'm familiar with, one of the first CCS plants in Houston, Texas, one of the places where I used to live. Adam Bruce, Global Head of Corporate Affairs for Mainstream Renewable Power, a global wind and solar developer with over 11 gigawatts of total pipeline assets and 9 gigawatts in development. So thank you for joining us all today. So first, what I want to do is just kind of go around with each of the speakers and give a little bit of background and ask a few questions. So I'm going to start with you, Camilla. So can you tell us, can you tell us a little bit more about your specific role and what SNAM has been doing within the hydrogen economy, especially as it relates to the future of hydrogen?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you, Russell. Hello, everybody. As Russell was saying, I run the corporate strategy department at SNAM. SNAM is Europe's largest gas infrastructure player, 41,000 kilometers of pipeline, 20 BCM of storage, and associates. It's sort of the biggest network, the big network in Italy, and associates in a number of European countries. And we're very interested in hydrogen for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is that Italy is an ideal place to produce hydrogen, to produce clean hydrogen, because it has ample solar resources and it's connected to North Africa via existing pipelines. So there's the potential for inputs for the really the best solar producing regions. So this is an important area of advantage for Italy, also in terms of potential exports of hydrogen to the European Union. And we think this is going to be a very big market, reaching 20 to 25% of final energy consumption. So, a massive share of the energy market by 2050. So in a zero carbon world. And SNAM's, what we're doing at the moment in terms of hydrogen is threefold. On the one hand, system design. So we're trying to figure out what a country, this 25% share of hydrogen in the mix, who's going to be using it, where is it going to be produced, what's the most efficient way of looking at this. You're going to be looking at very big hydrogen plants positioned close to the renewables, what role for hydrogen transport, how much of it will be delocalized, with electrolyzers near the points of consumption. So the idea is basically trying to turn something that is a scenario into something that works sort of on the ground. So that's step one. We're also doing a lot of work on asset readiness, so in ensuring that our pipelines are hydrogen compatible, hydrogen ready, we call it. And in that context was the experiment that you talked about, Russell. We delivered a 5% hydrogen blend in natural gas to 2 industrial customers in the south of Italy. We did this experiment again at the end of last year with a 10% blend. And so that demonstrates the possibility of using the existing network to deliver some hydrogen in blend with methane directly to customers. And in parallel, what we're doing is we're sort of running a hydrogen audit on our infrastructure to see how it would behave. And it turns out that about 70% of our existing pipelines, our underground piping, would be compatible with blends of hydrogen up to 100%. So that's also very interesting because it gives you a lot of optionality when you try and think of what a hydrogen system will look like. And the third thing that we are involved in is looking at the whole value chain. So we have a new hydrogen business unit that was launched last year, and they are in contact with operators along the value chain to understand the possibility for partnerships and for projects. So I think that's a little bit of an overview of where we are.
That sounds great. And I'd say, can you speak a little bit more as far as how long do you think it will be until we fully realize? I mean, I know that any type of energy transition has a long time frame. Give me some sense.
The really exciting thing about hydrogen is that as well as having a big long-term potential, it seems to be happening now. The European Hydrogen Strategy was launched yesterday, and they have a target for an amount of hydrogen production between 20 and 24. So there's already an initial push for it to happen quite quickly. And I think that's part of the reason why this market is so interesting, is that it seems to be at a tipping point where a relatively contained nudge, a relatively contained push could lower the cost of hydrogen and increase its market possibilities very quickly.
Oh, thank you. So Axel, so first of all, thank you on the hydrogen perspective. And I think that hydrogen is kind of, very far in the sense that, but solar has been kind of had a lot of progress here and now. So, what is your role in help me understand kind of what you feel like that the solar market is, where it is today and where is it going? I've looked at some stats and, this is a, over $200 billion market. And we see a lot of growth, but what is your perspective on solar?
Yeah, thanks, Russell. So yeah, I lead Sonadix. We are a global solar power producer. So we develop, finance, build, and operate solar power plants. Our biggest markets are in Europe, France, Italy, Spain. We're in the top 5 there. We are very active in Japan, one of the largest foreign solar producers, and in Chile. And we really have seen over the last 10 years a dramatic shift in overall renewable energy generation. And I think particularly in solar, when we started out 10 years ago, solar and wind were not cost competitive. They were on the start, maybe where hydrogen is right now, as Camilla said. They were starting on a journey towards really economic success, and this is where we are now. Over the last 10 years, Input costs have come down dramatically. Today, solar panel costs less than 10% than it cost in 2009 and 10. And that makes overall renewable, both wind and solar, cost competitive with conventional generation. I think I read a statistic the other day that today, new build electricity generation from wind and solar is cheaper than all other forms of generation for 2/3 of the human population. And I think that's a dramatic trajectory that the energy that the technology has been on. And really where we are now is we are able to build solar competitively, to compete with conventional generation and make a real difference for the energy transition. And that is what we are working on very actively. And we see obviously different speeds and different models in the different markets that we operate. But the things that we are primarily working on is really continuing on this competitiveness trajectory and addressing the problem of being able to compete with conventional generation, not just when the sun shines, but when the electricity is needed. Because I think that's one of the big the big hurdles that the industry needs to jump through in the next couple of years. And to that, we are investing, in addition to solar, we're looking obviously at energy storage and at other hybrid forms of generation to be successful there. We just signed our first 24-hour baseload PPA. It's in Chile. We were partnering with a wind producer to provide green electricity cost efficiently. So it's a competitive process. It's, you're competing against coal, gas, and other forms of generation when it's needed. And I think that's really where the industry is going, competing head-to-head without subsidies against conventional generation and on an even playing field. That's what we're looking for, and really have been very successful in the last 10 years, and looking forward to another big wave of success.
Thanks, Axel. I would say, we've seen certainly a huge change as far as the economics around solar and the growth. I guess what I would say is, what are still some of the barriers as far as to continue that kind of trajectory and progress into the future?
Yeah, what we need is, to a certain extent, really simple. So we need certainty of the ability to build, and certainty of our ability to sell and to contract with off-takers that need our power. And I think the big economic difference between us in conventional forms of generation, we have no fuel costs, so everything that we invest goes in up front, and we need to be confident that over the next 25, 30, 35 years that electricity can be consumed, and we're going to be remunerated for that. Our primary investors are ultimately pension funds, so we are not just looking at providing green, cost-efficient electricity, we're also looking at paying pensions for people, and that's really the thing that we're looking for. So the ability to contract in the long term, have certainty there is important, and signing corporate PPAs is important. We just joined European Energy Exchange to be able to market our electricity in other ways. And a big topic, and I think we're going to get to that later when we talk about the current crisis, is the ability to permit projects with certainty and with speed. Obviously, there are huge differences by country, but we see some countries where we can get to a project that's ready to build in a year, and other countries where it takes us 5-6 years, and there's significant uncertainty what the outcome will be. And really looking at the increase of our ability to compete there, and to make and to provide that electricity also timely, these I think are the big hurdles, in addition to the technology challenge of intermittency that I talked about before.
Excellent. That's excellent. So Lauren, tell me a little bit more about the CCS Institute and carbon capture, and help me kind of understand exactly, what it is, how it works, and just a little more background.
Thank you, Russell. Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute is an international think tank backed by governments, businesses, and NGOs, and our mission is to accelerate the deployment of CCS as an essential climate mitigation technology. I think there's no doubt that we're going through exceptionally challenging times with two crises, the health crisis and followed the concurrent economic crisis, whilst the third one, an existentialist almost climate crisis, is far from being resolved. And this year emissions are expected to be down by 8%, but this is far from being structural. And we need to deliver those emission reductions year on year, at least for the next decade, in order to meet our climate targets by mid-century. It's within this context that we need CCS. We need CCS in order to meet our climate targets and get to climate neutrality by 2050. In fact, this is the conclusion of the groundbreaking IPCC 1.5 report, which was released 2 years ago. It showed conclusively that we will need to have CCS. In fact, it's going to be extremely challenging, if not outright impossible, to reach the targets if we don't have CCS. There's carbon dioxide removal in 4 pathways of the report, and there's significant amounts of CCS in 3 of the pathways. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that CCS is not a silver bullet. We need to deploy it with solar and wind and clean hydrogen and energy efficiency and all the tools in our toolkit, but it's essential that it needs to be part of that portfolio. So what is carbon capture and storage? It's basically a set of technologies that enable capturing CO2 either from large emission sources or from the atmosphere and storing them safely underground, either in depleted oil and gas reservoirs or in geological formations. Thus, CCS can help meet our climate targets in a number of ways. First, it can reduce emissions, decarbonize emissions from large stationary emission sources such as power plants and factories. Cement, steel come to mind. Secondly, it can also help with the historic existing stock of CO2 in the atmosphere by literally sucking it from the air and storing underground. And thirdly, it can help with the production of clean hydrogen, which Camilla talked about, as a fuel, which when it's burned produces only water vapor and energy, and can then further be used to decarbonize heat and industry and transportation. And it's this versatility of CCS, the fact that it can be applied across sectors, but also that it can help with the stock and the flow of emissions into the atmosphere simultaneously, is what makes it, I think, such a unique and valuable climate tool. But in addition to being a climate tool, CCS can also be a driver of economic growth and employment. It can deliver clean growth opportunities, create new long-term clean industries such as in hydrogen, and it can help create and retain jobs and ensure a just transition. CCS facilities are large capital-intensive projects, and CCS creates jobs during the construction phase as well as during the operation phase and in the supply chain. To give a sense of scale, currently there are 59 large-scale CCS projects in the pipeline. 21 of these are operational and the remainder are in various different phases of development. In order to reach net zero by mid-century, we estimate that there will be 2,000 facilities that are needed. So from 21 operational, we'll need to scale up to 2,000 facilities. And we estimate that constructing and operating these facilities will create north of 100,000 new jobs, new employment by 2050. One unique characteristic of CCS is that it can help not only create new jobs, but it can help retain existing jobs. One of the key challenges of achieving a just transition is the potential mismatch between job creation and job losses. The fact that new jobs are created doesn't always happen. These new jobs don't always happen to be exactly at the same location or at the same time where the job losses can occur. And CCS facilities can facilitate the just transition by decarbonizing industries, by decarbonizing emission-intensive industries, and enable them to make a sustainable contribution to local economy. I think it's this dual characteristic of CCS, that it's a climate tool, but also driver in economic growth, that makes it an important element of recovery packages. We saw support for CCS following the global financial crisis, particularly in the US with the American Recovery Act, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, Russell, of 2009, which was behind the successful commissioning of several CCS facilities, the one that you're perhaps familiar with, Petronova. And we're anticipating and hoping that support for CCS in the current recovery packages being put in place at the moment will be the catalyst for the next wave of CCS development deployment, which we so urgently need to meet climate targets.
That's excellent. You know, what I think might be helpful is kind of help me understand, to accelerate to get to those kind of targets for 2,000 different plants. Help me kind of walk us through kind of the timeline of a typical, plant. And is that, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? Tell us kind of how that works as far as from the idea, the inception to the actual, completion of a CCS plant.
As I mentioned, these are highly complex, they're capital intensive projects, and it normally takes around probably 3 to 4 years. This is after the get-go. Once the final investment decision is made, probably we're looking at 3 years and probably a number of years before that. So it's not uncommon, unnatural to find 6, 7 years of that it takes from the kind of the idea to be conceptualized to development and deployment. That 2,000 facilities probably means somewhere like 70 to maybe so almost like 100 facilities per year, which sounds, I know, quite challenging, but this has been done before in other industries. I think we've done that with combined cycle power plants, I think between 1995 and 2010. So if the political will is there, if the business models are there, I think physically scaling up the infrastructure is certainly doable and very much within our reach.
Oh, that's excellent. So Adam, last but not least, I know that tell me a little bit more about mainstream renewable power and your role, and kind of talk to me a little about the outlook from your perspective.
Russell, thank you. It's a pleasure to be joining the session, and thank you also to your colleagues at Reuters for facilitating it. So mainstream renewable power, we are a global developer of utility scale wind and solar energy power plant. We operate over 4 platforms, 3 geographic and 1 technology. So Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and we have a global offshore wind platform as well. Just to give you some idea of the scale of the business. So on the offshore wind side, we've successfully developed round about somewhere between 20 and 25% of the UK's currently operational or in construction offshore wind fleet. We're the 2nd largest player in South Africa. We're developing Vietnam's first and largest offshore wind farm. And to come back to a country that's been discussed already both on the first panel and by Axel, we're the largest player in Chile. And I thought, if I may, just to look at that market in a bit more detail, because one of the things that the COVID crisis has done, and these are not my words, they're those of Michael Liebrich, it's sent us a postcard from the future. It's given us an idea of how the energy systems and electricity systems of the future will operate. And I think Chile is a market that you can see the structures of future energy markets. So Chile is a big open market. It's a classical liberal economy. There are no subsidies for any form of infrastructure development, very unlike our experience in Europe or North America for the development over the last decade of renewable energy. 3 or 4 years ago, they changed the procurement rules for electricity. They opened them to wind and solar generation, and effectively they run technology neutral auctions. They set a target and open the door to the auction. So 3 years ago in the auction, pretty much all the capacity up for auction was won by either wind or solar, beating fully amortized old coal that had been running for 10, 15 years. It beat new coal, it beat new gas. Lowest price was for solar, but the broad bulk of the power bid was wind. We won a portfolio of 1.3 gigawatts in that auction. And I use the word portfolio importantly because the rules of the auction are that you have to supply firm power. So it's the first country in the world, to my knowledge, which has said to the electricity sector and to the variable generation sector of wind and solar, come and play in this market, but you have to provide firm power. So we've developed a portfolio of projects down the spine with solar in the north, wind and solar in the middle and the bottom. And we're investing $2 billion to build that at the moment. And the reason I said that COVID is sending us a postcard from the future, because if you look at the IEA's report on the green recovery and the amount of jobs that ride on a successful investment package in wind and solar, we can see projects in Chile under construction, keeping people at work, creating employment, creating opportunities, and ultimately supplying electricity to onto the grid by 2022, to give the country the confidence, as was discussed in your first panel this afternoon, to accelerate its NDCs and to accelerate its climate ambition. So it's a virtual circle in that sense. And I think, looking at the topics for discussion today, I think Axel and I would hopefully give you a sense of confidence that unlike the 2008 financial crisis, that today wind and solar energy are in a place where they can be deployed very quickly, very effectively, more cheaply than any other technology to provide reliable and resilient electricity to help power the recovery from COVID.
Well, thank you, Adam. I guess one question I'd like to kind of understand a little bit more, maybe about a particular offshore use case and kind of how that develops and where those are being developed, and what do you see kind of as the challenges in offshore wind development?
Offshore wind has a huge opportunity. I was privileged to serve for 3 years as the first chairman of an organisation called the UK's Offshore Wind Programme Board, which the UK government asked me to chair. And I think that was the first signal, at least in the UK, of the realization by the government of the huge opportunity that offshore wind provided, both in the transition, and Gloria spoke about the transition from hydrocarbons to renewables. So the UK has a massive hydrocarbon footprint that it needs to transition out of. So there's an opportunity to segue from one industry to the next in the North Sea. There's an opportunity to have a properly interconnected electricity generation market in Europe's northern seas, connecting Denmark, Scandinavia, the UK, and the continent, to route power from the north and to route solar from the south into customers right across Europe. And then in other countries, the East Coast US, West Coast US, there's an opportunity to avoid the bottlenecks in existing grids and supply power again into major load centers. But what is fascinating is a piece of work that the World Bank did last year to map offshore wind opportunities in emerging economies. And for a country like Vietnam, for example, with Vietnam, and this was a surprise to me, Vietnam's total available offshore wind resource is the same as the United Kingdom's. I mean, this is a massive opportunity for Vietnam, for the Philippines, potentially for Indonesia. I mean, if you look at the next 10 years, at the medium to long-term economic recovery out of what's coming after COVID, I mean, Southeast Asia is the engine room, is going to be the engine room of that recovery. And to give those countries the opportunity not just to develop onshore, but offshore, I think gives policymakers a range that they can call on, and gives them the confidence that if they incentivize investment not just in solar and wind onshore but in offshore wind, they will have the power, they will have the electricity available to power that recovery. And of course, looking at the other technologies represented on this panel today, I mean, to deliver hydrogen, to deliver CCS, we're going to need huge amounts of electricity, in addition to electrifying transport and electrifying the heating and cooling sectors as well. So again, offshore wind provides an opportunity for the generation of very, very large amounts of electricity, in relatively concentrated geographical areas, particularly in those either very fast-growing emerging economies or in the existing industrialized economies. So we're very bullish on offshore wind, as you would expect. It's not an easy play in that sense. It's not an easy, it's far more complex than developing onshore, but it gives policymakers that range of opportunities, that extra tool to enable us to meet some very challenging transition goals if we're to stick to the Paris targets.
That's great, and thanks for sharing some of those regional, challenges. I think that's what I want to do, is kind of shift the discussion. First of all, I think we all are starting to see that this kind of green energy economy can certainly drive jobs, drive economic recovery. But one of the things that I feel like is happening is there are a lot of regional differences. So I know in the US we've had some setbacks and some challenges, but I know that the European Union has moved forward with some $1 trillion commitments, some significant commitments around sustainable energy and targets. And I know, and working with a lot of utilities in the US, we've got regional utilities that are starting to have very aggressive targets, let's say in the West and the Southwest of the US. So give me some of your perspectives as far as comparing regional attitudes and approaches, and kind of where do you feel that there's similarities and where do you feel that there's differences, given your perspectives and various experiences. And I'll leave it open, so who wants to go?
You're happy to start?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think to take a step back, I think what we see today, the COVID crisis, really is primarily a human crisis. So we are looking at a challenge that is unprecedented in terms of scale and speed. And I think it's understandable that the stimulus payment, the enormous amounts of commitments that have been made, are particularly focused on addressing that. However, that is at the same time is an enormous opportunity to use that money to direct and really make a change as to how we're addressing the other big crisis that is maybe not perceived to be as urgent and not as immediately threatening to livelihoods and individual outcomes today, but definitely will be in the next decade. And today, I think, to be very frank, there is a high risk of that opportunity being squandered. So what we've seen in terms of tangible commitments, I think, has been very limited. There's a lot of high-level, let's call it, intent that is being communicated, but it is not yet being translated into something that is tangible. And I think if you look at what type of outcome, what is that we're looking for, I think timeliness is very, very, very important. And Adam mentioned that at the beginning. If we look at the impact that we want to see or that society needs from this, it's timeliness. So it's about certainty, where this is going to go and how it's going to affect society. So I think that's kind of a middle of June view. And I think a lot of things have been announced since by the European Union and I think in Europe particularly, but the amount of stimulus that has green strings attached versus the amount of stimulus that has kind of is more, I don't know, I don't want to use a color because it might not be appropriate for the forum, but that's definitely not green. There's a tenfold difference, and the rest is kind of colorless and not clear. It's kind of spread out wide across overall across all the sectors, and that is problematic. I think Japan is the highest per kind of in percent of GDP, highest stimulus payment. There's no tangible green. The US has very little tangible green, and in Europe it's at a kind of the amount that's really been focused and where people can rely on is not that big. And happy to hear kind of from other sectors, but what I see right now is there's a continuation of the trajectory that we're on already. So there's enormous popular political support for the energy transition. That is great. In addition, it makes economic sense. If we look at particularly green energy generation, we talked about it before, it is competitive, it is scalable, it is here now. But as I think Camilla said before, there are technologies that need a little push, and there is the potential for enormous acceleration at the same time as providing jobs and also being able to build in this infrastructure for the long term. And I think we really need to see a little bit more of that.
Agreed.
For my part, if I can jump in, I'm encouraged by the language that's being used by the strategy that came out yesterday. It talks about something just under 500 billion of accumulated investments required and 1 million jobs. I think there's definitely a realization of the opportunity of tackling the two crises together, as Axel was saying.
And if I may add onto that, clearly the current COVID crisis is devastating, but it also, if there's any silver lining, it presents an opportunity to reset our economies, to, as the title of this conference is, to build back better, a system that's much more inclusive, resilient to shocks, and lower in carbon. When it comes to CCS, when I look across the two sides of the Atlantic, or actually around the world, clearly there are a large number of countries that are committed to net zero. UK was the first amongst those, so is the EU. At a federal level, US is not, and again at a federal level, Australia is not. Having said that, we see support for CCS in all these countries or geographies that I mentioned, because it's not only for climate, but also for job creation and low carbon economy, creation of low carbon economies. It's interesting that it had the tax credit for CCS in the US had bipartisan support back in 2018. And I just find that the types of support that's provided differs from geography to geography, which is something that one would expect. For example, there's carbon pricing in UK and Europe versus there's a tax credit in the US, because of course tax credits are much more better understood in the US context from the history with wind and solar, etc. Having said that, as we've just been discussing, there's a lot of proposals on the table, particularly EU. There's the Next Generation EU, there's a strategic investment fund within it, which includes CCS or talks about CCS and clean hydrogen, etc. In the UK, there is the CCS infrastructure fund, but these are developments which we are looking forward to seeing actually being implemented. And as with these things, the proof will always be in the pudding.
Always about the execution.
Russell, if I may, I mean, I'd echo all of those sentiments. I mentioned it in my earlier piece that COVID, in relation to the energy economy, is sending us a postcard from the future. And one of your panelists in an earlier session was discussing how the impact, the current economic impact, has allowed us to see our cities free of environmental pollution. And one of the drivers for the transition that I see accelerating, if you look at countries like the Philippines, where Congress has passed a moratorium on new coal, on Vietnam, where the governing party, the Communist Party, has effectively transitioned the country away from coal towards renewables and gas. The drivers for these, as well as the cost and energy security and resilience piece, is about popular pressure around environmental pollution. And my sense of when we do build back and build back better is that the popular will outpace and will run ahead of political will, and the demand will be there for, we cannot go back to the levels of pollution and environmental pollution that we had pre-COVID, and this will be another spur to action. I mean, there are so many of sort of the myths that have tumbled through the last 9 months. We come back into the UK. I mean, National Grid has very, very successfully operated the grid, both variable, large amounts of variable supply, so the amount of wind and solar in the mix, as well as all the other renewables, got north of 60%, and is now regularly at 30-35%. That's been managed very, very effectively. But equally, due to COVID, we're seeing very large and very variable switches in demand as well, and that's being managed effectively too. So we're seeing in real time what the grid that we've been talking about in abstract and theoretically. Just last week, 50 Hertz, which runs the grid in Eastern Germany and other parts of Northern Europe, published a paper saying that they're entirely convinced that by 2032, which in electricity economy terms is like tomorrow, by 2032 they'll be running an entirely 100% renewable grid with wind, primarily wind, solar, storage, and hydro. And again, the technical challenge is no longer a challenge. Carbon Tracker would be another organisation that I would cite very supportively here. I mean, again, if you go back to the 2008 financial crash, if you'd walked into an investment firm in the City of London and said, what are you doing about stranded assets? They would have, they wouldn't have given you the time of day. And now it's a central part of most people's investment strategy. And I think they had a paper out last week with the Rocky Mountain Institute showing that if you were to close something like 80% of the US's coal fleet tomorrow and replaced it with wind and solar power and storage, even at the relative cost of storage today, you'd have an annual saving to US bill payers of about $10 billion a year. And I think the other thing the US administration is showing us very clearly at the moment is you cannot revive a corpse. Doesn't matter how much stimulus you apply to the US coal sector, it's dead. And the global coal sector is heading in the same direction, just because we have something we can do that is better, cheaper, quicker to build, and employs just as many, if not more, people. So maybe I'm too optimistic, but I have a degree of confidence that we have the tools, we have the technology. Talked earlier about how Japan has announced today that it's basically ending export finance for coal, with some exceptions. Again, this is all part of a conversation moving at speed in the right direction. And I think that build back, certainly; build back better, absolutely, because there is no alternative, because the betterness is already baked in that sense.
Oh, that's good. And I think I want to talk a little bit more about the role of that kind of economic stimulus and what has really changed, recently. Because, politics aside, I feel like that there's definitely some economics that are, where we've got certain forms of energy that are starting to become very, cost competitive. But at the same time, we have others that are, still being developed and still require maybe some additional stimulus funding. So I guess help me understand kind of what your perspectives are on, the COVID stimulus funding that's occurring because of this immediate crisis versus kind of this next wave of, new clean energy stimulus funding, and how does this kind of roll out, over the next few years? I mean, what does that look like from your all perspective? Who wants to go first? Lauren.
Shall I go first?
Yes.
So the recovery plan, a sustainable recovery plan, should have three goals. It's to boost economy, create and retain jobs, and to build a more resilient and cleaner energy system. And I think you were talking about it, Russell, in terms of the time frames as well. And I think it's important to think about the short, medium, and the longer term, and perhaps almost characterize that as the rescue period, the recovery period, and the transformation period. I think it is just in the short term, undoubtedly, we're going to see governments being occupied with keeping people in their jobs. That's only natural. But I think and that's very much the rescue period. But as we move from rescue to recovery, and I think in some parts of the world we're already moving there, we discussed, for example, EU, I think focus will probably be in the next few months on, particularly in terms of clean energy and clean economy, those fast, labor-intensive technologies with high multipliers. And the first thing that, of course, comes to mind is things like home insulation. And we already heard in the UK yesterday in the Chancellor's speech about a significant amount of money being poured into that, and that makes sense. I think it's the short, as we look from short to medium term and in the longer term, the transformation phase, that investing in clean infrastructure projects becomes crucial, such as electricity grids. And of course, that's when CCS comes into play. I think when it comes to CCS, governments can do a lot, both in terms of policy and in terms of investment, particularly to facilitate the development of infrastructure. And with that, I mean particularly carbon dioxide, CO2 pipelines and storage. And I believe this would represent good value for money, because common infrastructure, having a common used CO2 infrastructure, could encourage multiple industrial users to connect to it. It could help decarbonize industrial clusters, which a number of them are already developing these concepts in the UK. We have Teesside, Humber, in Scotland near the North Sea, etc. And we have these clusters. There's in Norway that's being developed, the Norway Full Chain Project, and also in Port of Rotterdam. We've got shovel-ready CCS projects that are looking for a further government sort of nudge in terms of finalizing policies or finalizing investments to go ahead. And I think utilizing these opportunities will be crucial to create those next wave of CCS facilities, as I mentioned before.
That sounds good. What about from a hydrogen perspective? No?
Absolutely. So I think that the speed at which you want to move on a policy, as Lauren was saying, it's a question of was recovery, rescue recovery, and then what you need by when. so for hydrogen, for example, the objective of scaling it up very quickly comes from the realization that you will have industrial reinvestment cycles to deal with. So because it's going to have it's going to be used in large part by industry, and industry have 25-year investment.
Camelia, I think you're cutting out. So we'll have to hear more once we get reconnected. So maybe I should go ahead and just transition. What about from a wind and solar perspective? Given the fact that there's been a lot of economic stimulus in those sectors and the prices have come down, what's your perspective as far as economic stimulus going forward?
Shall I pick that one up, Russell?
Sure.
Yeah, if I may paraphrase Keith Anderson, the Chief Executive of Scottish Power Iberdrola here in the UK, who was asked a similar question on a forum very recently, and his answer was electrify the hell out of everything. This is an ultimate no regret strategy. We can build low cost, large scale wind and solar technology to deliver the electricity today that will be needed not just in the transition, but to do all the things that Lauren and Camilla want to do, in the medium term. And another very wise person said that there can be no transition without transmission. And grid has been the sort of Cinderella in the piece for a long time. And nobody's been entirely sure who's responsible for it. And even in the European Union, even in Europe, which has sort of led at least the first transition to renewables from 2000 to 2020, it was very national focused, and there wasn't the focus on interconnection. And I think if we are to, it's not a question of me thinking, if we are to really transition and scale up into the hundreds of gigawatts of new capacity, we need to build the transmission backbone, not just to deliver electricity, not just so that Axel and I can do more of what we want to do, but so that we build the networks for electric vehicles and for the other electrification of transport, and for the generation of other products, and for the heating and cooling sectors. So, yes, you're right. Wind and solar as technologies don't need the economic focus that perhaps they needed in 2008. But what we do need as part of the recovery is regulation for tomorrow's electricity market. There's no point building back the structures and the regulations for the coal-fired electricity markets of the 1980s. We need the regulations that will enable electric vehicles and enable the wider electrification of the global energy economy, and that has to be sped up. So there has to be a focus on procurement, on removing the barriers to deployment. Again, in Europe, the UK, the Netherlands, Denmark Germany will all have tenders for offshore wind in the next 2 or 3 years. I mean, those tenders could be for twice as much capacity. That electricity will find a home, it will find customers. The same in Southeast Asia, the same in Latin America. We can be the stimulus to power the recovery in that sense.
Good. Axel, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm actually very encouraged by the positivity of my fellow panelists. I think I was maybe a little bit on the kind of more negative side, but I do firmly believe that we are in the middle of a societal change, but it's about the acceleration. So yes, there are lots of positive news. There's public support, there's political support, at least verbally, but we are not on track today. I think it's very clear, right? We need to reduce by almost 4% a year CO2 emissions from energy until 2050, and we are increasing. Now this year, yes, we're going to reduce because there is a dramatic shift, and the reason that is a positive thing is that it shows us that it can be done. But if we don't lock it in, and if these tens of trillions of stimulus payments are not being used in a directive form, I think we might find ourselves in 2022 basically on the same path. And that is personally for me, and I think for the team that works here at Sonetics, it's a fairly scary prospect. I do agree with especially things that the things that Adam said in terms of where this can be helpful, where stimulus payments can be directed. I think, you know, green generation is a smart economic move today. New transmission is great for allowing more deployment, but also directly affects transmission losses. So there's an immediate CO2 reduction impact if that is done. New R&D to address the intermittency challenges that we still have, and loosening restrictions on permitting to allow for faster projects permitting and certainty of contract. So what we see in tenders, if we can increase that, gives higher certainty of payment. That doesn't actually provide any subsidies. It's just about the ability to build with confidence. That will have a huge impact, and that can provide the acceleration that we need in parallel to more R&D deployment, particularly in the other technologies that I mentioned, storage, hydrogen, CCS, to put us on that path.
Oh, thank you. So one last theme before we head into the Q&A. I want to kind of talk a little bit more about the role of technology. And you know, what role does technology play? And from my perspective, a couple of things are happening. Is anytime you have an energy transition, you always have new innovation that comes out of it, and I think that helps to spur growth and opportunity, which we've talked about. I also feel like that, you know, this current crisis, just from my perspective, is we've talked at Dell for a long time about digital transformation and workforce transformation. And, you know, this crisis has done more for remote workforce, I think, than accelerating that. And I think it's going to be the same from an energy perspective. So help me kind of maybe from a digital technology perspective, give me your sense of, you know, what role does that play in the transition, and how do the various, you know, kind of technology companies and leaders in the technology, how do they help in that transition from your perspective? Who wants to take it? Camilla, you're back. I want to give you a chance.
Sure, I'm back. Apologies for that.
No worries.
So I think obviously innovation and technology are a key part of it. As Axel was saying, I think there is a lot to do. We're not going to get to net zero without innovation. A huge amount of emissions reductions that we need depend on technologies that are either, you know, they're certainly not mature. They could be at a sort of at an early stage where all they need is scale to get to, you know, to be mature, to be market systems. So, you know, for example, electrolyzers and fuel cells. I think at that point we're looking at a question that's mainly a question of scale. And then there's technologies which, you know, where you've got a prototype, maybe you've got a few demonstration projects, but you even need to get to the early stage, and technologies that are, you know, in the lab at the moment. So, you know, if you're looking at hydrogen, there's a lot of talk about methane pyrolysis, where you'd make hydrogen directly from methane without CCS at this point. But that's a technology that we haven't really seen working yet. I mean, it's something definitely worth keeping an eye on. But I think one of the priorities in this effort to build back better is to ensure that we don't take our eye off the ball on the R&D side either, and we maintain technology spend and investment as we look ahead. It may not be shovel ready, as the expression is.
Lauren?
It's certainly something that's going to bring a benefit.
Thank you. And I completely agree with Camilla that because of the time lag that you know, in terms of bringing sort of technologies to market, mean that we shouldn't, you know, lose the sight. We should invest in technology innovation today in order, as a near-term priority, in order to be in a position to meet our longer-term climate targets. And I think governments have a potentially key role to play in this in early stage technology, where perhaps private companies may find it especially too risky, and in fact public-private partnerships kind of do have a big role to play in this. When I look at carbon capture and storage, it's a proven technology that's been around since the 1970s. in some applications it's fairly mature, for example in gas processing and in fertilizer, but there are other applications such as direct air capture, and also in hard to abate industry in cement, steel, etc., where the technology arguably is still in the early stages and would certainly benefit from more R&D, and a number of our members, Carbfix, Sea Capture, Calix, are working on solutions, innovative solutions on the capture and storage side. And when I talked about direct air capture last week, we heard after the Prime Minister Johnson's speech here, the UK government announced 100 million funding for direct air capture, which was quite positively surprising. In the US, direct air capture obviously gets a lot of attention and focus from companies and the government. So certainly there are sort of, even for, and I'm sure that's the case for other sort of more mature technologies like wind and solar, there's potential for innovation, but there's also potential to push forward what we're doing in terms of the more nascent innovative technologies.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Shall I jump in, Russell, if I may? And we're a big fan of innovation, and we've seen a lot of it, both in wind and solar. And I think Axel mentioned, and it was certainly discussed earlier, I mean, the innovation that has led to very rapid falls in the levelized cost of energy for both wind and solar, is testament to that. But if I give you two stories, really. I've been in the wind sector for the best part of 20 years, and the first wind farm we built in the UK and Scotland, relatively small, modest first project, to maintain each of those turbines, to do blade inspections, you need to get two people into the tower, up harness, up onto the top, and one of them would then rope down and do a manual inspection. Of course, you had to stop the turbine, so you weren't generating electricity, you weren't providing electricity, you weren't paying your bankers back either. So the incentive was to do it quickly. Human nature being what it was, cracks and other imperfections were probably missed. Then they'd rope back up again, down, and go off for a cup of tea. 15 years later, those blade inspections are done by fleets of autonomous drones using big data and machine learning to work out on their second and third and fourth and fifth pass that something they thought was something a bird had left behind is actually a crack or a hairline fracture or something, or not anything. And that's just in one small sector of the technology that has huge savings, both in terms of power output, but also in it keeps the bankers happy. and then the second aspect is offshore wind, which we were talking about earlier. So I'm sitting here in my office in Edinburgh. Apologies if you can hear the seagulls in the background, but I got a window open. Mainstream Wind, we successfully developed a 450 megawatt offshore wind farm about 30 miles downriver from where I'm sitting. When we took that project into planning in 2009, the standard industry offshore wind turbine was a 3 megawatt machine. So 450 megawatt project, over 100 turbines. That had a big footprint in the environment. There were conversations to be had with a range of stakeholders about the space we were going to take up for the project. When that project goes into construction later this year and next year, the turbines will be 11 megawatt machines, and so you reduce the number, you reduce the footprint, generate just as much electricity, and that's in less than a decade. I mean, this is extraordinary speed of transformation and development in the sector, and you can use those examples in solar, bifacial. You can use them in storage. You can use them right across our sector. And again, it goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier. All of this should give government confidence that we don't need stimulus. We don't need subsidy in the way that we needed perhaps in 2008. But just open the doors. Let us compete. Let us get out there and develop, build projects, and we can provide very large amounts of meaningful electricity for you to power all the other things you want to do, whether it's transport, heat, and the rest of it. No, innovation has a huge role and will be very, very significant to help us stick to the Paris pathways and all the other things that we want to do.
Excellent example, Adam. I see drone inspections even within our utility vertical as a viable solution instead of putting people at risk, helping safety and, identifying problems with assets. So absolutely great example. I want to go ahead and transition into a quick Q&A. There's more questions than we can probably get to, but I want to throw out a few. So I'm going to just leave it open and you can just raise your hand on which one. I'm going to try to maintain positivity on some of these, just given some of the wording, but so one question is around rapid decarbonization and could it potentially have an impact as far as additional recessions or, negative consequences from a rapid decarbonization? You want to take that one?
I'll let Axel. I was monopolizing the microphone a moment ago. So
I could take it really quickly. I think actually at the minute, the objectives of decarbonization and economic recovery align. If you think about the value to taxpayers of not investing in stranded assets, for example, that helps you understand why the two things, in large part, do work together.
Axel? Thank you.
Yeah, I think rapid. There's rapid and rapid. So, but let's stick to the plans that are being actually developed and portrayed. I think none of the plans that I've seen have a negative economic impact. They are primarily based on really increasing in investment in R&D and infrastructure to at the same time decarbonize. I'm an energy efficient building. This is why I constantly.
We've all had that before.
We have invested in this, and actually demand management is a whole other side on the technology side that I want to bring up. But I think what we really see is an enormous opportunity for additional employment. And if we look at some very, very simple things, building new solar plants generates roughly 8 times as many jobs as building new coal or a new gas plant. It's very, very simplified, but those are the numbers. Maintaining solar and wind is much more labor intensive than maintaining coal and gas, and it's local. These are local jobs that are being generated. So if you talk about the effects of decarbonization, particularly in energy generation, I think they are boosting employment. If we talk about demand management, there is huge potential for additional investment in highly paying jobs across multiple industries. And I think I'm not worried about the economic effects of decarbonization. I'm worried about it's not being fast enough.
Russell, I'm going to have to jump in here and spoil the party. Unfortunately, we've already run over our time and we're going to have to cut things there. I do apologize for anyone that sent in any questions and didn't manage to have them answered. Sorry, Russell, please forgive me. But I'd like to thank both Russell and our panel for another brilliant discussion. Sorry, we couldn't just have a few more minutes to get to all of your questions, but we have to close things down, unfortunately, today. But thank you for everyone that's joined us on both sides of the virtual stage over the past 3 hours. Remember, all the sessions will be available on demand on this platform for the next 2 weeks. So you can share them with your friends, colleagues, partners to make sure they get up to date with all the great discussions we've had over the past few hours. They will also be available on demand on the Energy Transition Europe and North America websites, which you'll see both down the side of your screen right now. Whilst that does bring us to the end of the symposium today, we cannot afford to let the momentum for sustainable growth and climate action drop. The time for action is very much definitely now, and the energy transition must be placed at the epicenter of all plans for recovery post-COVID-19. That's why these discussions will be continuing at the Reuters Events Energy Transition Summits, which we'll be holding in November. If you would like more information, simply click the banners at the side of your screen right now. We hope you can join us. It's absolutely free, so there's no reason not to sign up today. There's also even more brilliant coming your way from Reuters Events on the energy transition, with a stats report and white paper both due this month. Check your inboxes from emails from Owen Roltz. And if you'd like to know any more or want to get involved in the events in November, please do reach out to Owen and the energy transition team. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you from everyone at Reuters Events. We hope you have a great day. Hope to see you in November. Thank you. Take care.